Eric stood on the front porch of his modest cabin, the sanctuary sprawling behind him, as the first blush of spring painted the distant treetops in hues of green and pink. He took a deep breath, the crisp morning air carrying the faint, earthy scent of the surrounding forest. It was a moment of peace he treasured, before the sanctuary came alive with the sounds of injured demi-humans stirring and his assistant, Kayla, bustling about to start the day. The clang of a bucket startled him, and he turned to see Kayla struggling to carry a load of water from the well. She was slight, her wolf-like ears twitching as she balanced the bucket with determined care. Her tail swayed behind her, betraying her effort to stay steady. "Kayla, you'll strain your back like that," Eric said, stepping off the porch. She flinched and turned, her golden eyes widening before narrowing with stubbornness. "I can handle it, Eric." "Sure you can," he replied, taking the bucket from her anyway. "But if you pull something, I'm the one who has to deal with it." Kayla huffed, crossing her arms. "I'm not a pup, you know." Eric gave her a small, teasing smile. "Could have fooled me with how you were wobbling just now." Her tail flicked, an unmistakable sign of annoyance, but she didn't argue further as he carried the bucket to the main pen. The morning passed in their usual routine. Eric checked on the larger animals, mostly demi-humans with severe injuries who needed isolation and extra care, while Kayla handled feeding and light cleaning duties. It was a rhythm they'd perfected over the past year, built on mutual respect and unspoken trust. But today, Eric noticed something different about Kayla. Her usual lively chatter was subdued, her movements less energetic. She kept avoiding his gaze, her ears twitching nervously whenever he came too close. At first, he chalked it up to fatigue, but as the day wore on, her behavior became harder to ignore. By evening, Eric was sitting at the dining table, cleaning his sword, a relic from his nightly days, when Kayla finally spoke. She stood in the doorway to the main room, clutching a stack of folded blankets. Her voice was hesitant, a stark contrast to her usual cheerfulness. "Eric, can I ask you something?" He set the sword down and looked at her. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, her ears drooping slightly as she shifted her weight. "It's nothing. Never mind." "Kayla," he said, his tone soft but firm. "If something's bothering you, tell me." She glanced at him, her golden eyes filled with a mix of anxiety and something he couldn't quite place. Then, shaking her head, she muttered, "It's not important. Good night, Eric." Before he could press further, she turned and disappeared down the hallway. Eric leaned back in his chair, frowning. Something was definitely wrong. That night, he was jolted awake by a sound outside his room. Instincts honed from years on the battlefield kicked in, and he grabbed the dagger he kept under his pillow. The faint creak of the wooden floorboards grew louder, then stopped just outside his door. "Kayla?" he called, his voice low but steady. There was no response, but he could hear the sound of uneven breathing. Slowly, he got out of bed and opened the door. Kayla stood there, trembling, her face flushed, and her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Her hands clutched the fabric of her nightdress, twisting it nervously. "Kayla, what's wrong?" he asked, stepping closer. I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't stay in my room." Her scent hit him then, a warm, earthy aroma, sharper and more intoxicating than usual. It was a scent he'd occasionally noticed before, but never this strong. Realization dawned on him as pieces clicked together. Her strange behavior, her hesitance, her presence at his door in the dead of night. "It's the season, isn't it?" he asked carefully. Kayla's ears flattened, and she looked away, ashamed. "I didn't want to bother you. I thought I could handle it, but it's too much. Her voice cracked, and she hugged herself tightly. Eric sighed, his heart heavy. He understood now why she'd been acting so strangely, but the weight of her struggle made his chest tighten. "You're not a bother, Kayla," he said, his voice gentle. "Go inside. You're trembling." She hesitated but eventually nodded, stepping into his room. Eric guided her to sit on the edge of his bed. She clutched the blankets around her, her hands shaking. I can't think straight, she admitted, her voice thick with frustration. I keep feeling things I don't understand. It's like my body isn't my own. Eric knelt in front of her, his expression soft but serious. You don't have to go through this alone, he said. We'll figure it out, but you need to trust me. Kayla looked at him, her eyes brimming with a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. Slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. Her touch was hesitant, almost trembling, but when he didn't pull away, she seemed to relax. Thank you, she whispered. Eric nodded, squeezing her hand briefly before pulling away. You should rest, he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. You can stay here tonight if you want. Kayla hesitated but eventually lay down, curling into a small ball on the far side of the bed. Eric sat back in his chair, his mind racing as he tried to process the situation. The scent lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the challenges ahead. For now, he focused on keeping his promise, to protect her no matter what. As the night stretched on, he stayed by her side, knowing this was only the beginning of a difficult season. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow over the room. Eric woke with a start, the memory of the previous night still fresh in his mind. His eyes fell on Kayla, who was still curled up on the far side of the bed, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. She looked peaceful now, a stark contrast to the trembling figure who had stood at his door hours ago. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. This was new territory for him, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his chest. He wasn't just Kayla's protector. She depended on him in ways he hadn't fully grasped until now. Kayla stirred, her ears twitching before her golden eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she looked disoriented, her gaze darting around the room until it settled on Eric. Her cheeks flushed as she sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Good morning, she murmured, her voice soft. Morning, he replied, his tone calm but firm. How are you feeling? Kayla hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. A little better, I think, she said, though her lowered gaze betrayed lingering discomfort. Eric nodded, choosing his next words carefully. We need to talk about this, Kayla. What happened last night, and what's happening to you now? Her ears flattened slightly, and she hugged the blanket closer. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to. Stop, he interrupted gently, his voice firm but kind. You have nothing to apologize for, but we need to figure out how to manage this. It's not safe for you to leave the sanctuary in this state, and I won't risk you getting hurt. Kayla's eyes met his briefly, gratitude flickering in their depths. Thank you, she said quietly. Eric stood and stretched, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. First things first, he said. You should eat something. I'll take care of the chores today. You focus on resting. Kayla opened her mouth to protest but stopped when she saw the determined look on his face. Instead, she nodded, letting the blanket fall as she stood. By midday, Eric had thrown himself into the sanctuary's work, using the physical labor to clear his mind. The animals needed care, and repairs to the fencing kept him busy. Despite his efforts to distract himself, his thoughts kept drifting back to Kayla. She had stayed in the cabin as he'd insisted, but her presence was palpable even from a distance. He found himself scanning the windows more often than necessary, his chest tightening whenever he thought of her vulnerability. Around noon, he decided to seek advice. There was a demi-human herbalist in the nearby village, someone who might know more about Kayla's condition. The trek was short, and the herbalist, a fox-like demi-human named Lyrian, greeted him with a knowing smile. Let me guess, Lyrian said, leaning on her counter. Spring has you humans in a frenzy because you forgot about our seasons again. Eric's jaw tightened, but he forced a calm tone. I need something to help a wolf girl manage her instincts. She's struggling. Lyrian's teasing expression softened. It's not that simple, Eric. You can't suppress something that's natural to us. Her instincts are part of who she is, especially during mating season. Then what can I do? He asked, his frustration slipping into his voice. Lyrian tilted her head, her ears flicking thoughtfully. Be patient. Keep her calm and let her know she's safe. The worst of it will pass in time, but she's going to need your support. Eric frowned. That's it? Just wait it out. Pretty much, Lyrian said with a shrug. Though, if she trusts you, she might naturally gravitate toward you for comfort. It's instinctual. He thanked her and left, her words echoing in his mind. If Kayla's instincts made her lean on him, he would need to tread carefully. Trust was a fragile thing and he couldn't afford to break it. By the time he returned, the sun was low on the horizon, casting the sanctuary in golden light. He found Kayla sitting on the porch, her legs pulled up to her chest. She looked up as he approached, her ears perking slightly. You were gone for a while, she said, her voice tinged with worry. I went to see Lyrian, he replied, sitting down beside her. Wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything important. Kayla's tail twitched nervously. And? Did she say anything? She said it'll pass, Eric said simply. But until then, you need to take it easy. No overexerting yourself. No unnecessary risks. Kayla frowned, her hands tightening around her knees. I don't want to be a burden, Eric. You're not, he said firmly, meeting her gaze. This is what the sanctuary's for. To keep you and everyone else here safe. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. But then her expression shifted, uncertainty flickering across her face. There's more, isn't there? She asked quietly. Eric hesitated. Lyrian mentioned that you might rely on me more than usual during this time. It's normal, she said. Part of your instincts. Kayla's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, her ears flattening. I don't mean to. It's just, you make me feel safe. And when everything else feels overwhelming, You don't have to explain, he interrupted gently. I understand. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken words. Finally, Kayla reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing against his hand. Eric didn't pull away, letting her touch linger as she spoke. Thank you, she said softly, for not pushing me away. Eric gave her a small, reassuring smile. I made a promise to protect you, Kayla. That hasn't changed. The moment hung in the air, fragile yet significant. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sanctuary in shadows, Eric knew they were only at the beginning of what would be a challenging season. But for now, they sat in quiet understanding, neither ready to break the fragile peace. The next few days settled into a delicate balance between routine and unspoken tension. Kayla tried her best to resume her usual tasks, but it was clear to Eric that she was struggling. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, as though she was trying to suppress something inside her. Every now and then, her golden eyes would linger on him, filled with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Eric busied himself with his duties, using the work to distract himself from the charged atmosphere. The sanctuary demanded constant care, and he took comfort in its familiarity. Still, Kayla's presence weighed on his mind, her proximity a constant reminder of the fragile situation they were in. One evening, as the last light of day faded, Eric was in the workshop repairing a broken fence post. The rhythmic sound of his hammer striking the wood was soothing, a steady beat against the backdrop of chirping crickets. Eric! Kayla's voice came softly from the doorway, breaking his focus. He looked up to find her standing there, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She was wearing one of his old tunics, the oversized fabric brushing against her knees. It was a common enough sight, but tonight, with the firelight casting a warm glow around her, she looked different, vulnerable yet captivating. What is it, Kayla? He asked, setting the hammer down. She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the ground. I couldn't sleep, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Eric wiped his hands on a rag and motioned for her to come closer. Is something bothering you? Kayla stepped into the workshop, the faint scent of wildflowers trailing after her. She perched on a stool across from him, her tail curling around her legs. It's hard to explain, she said after a moment. It's like there's this restlessness inside me. No matter what I do, it won't go away. Eric leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms. Have you been eating enough? Resting? She nodded. I've tried, but it doesn't help. It's not something I can fix with food or sleep. Her eyes met his then, filled with a quiet desperation that made his chest ache. I thought I could handle it on my own, she continued, her voice trembling. But I can't. It's too much. Eric studied her for a long moment, his mind racing. Lyrian's words echoed in his thoughts. Asterisk, she'll lean on you if she trusts you. It's instinctual. Asterisk. You're not alone, Kayla, he said finally, his tone steady. Whatever you're going through, we'll face it together. Her eyes widened slightly, and she leaned forward, her hands clutching the edge of the stool. Do you mean that? Of course, he replied. You're not just my assistant. You're part of my life, Kayla. I'm not going to let you face this by yourself. Kayla's ears twitched, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. She stood then, taking a hesitant step toward him. Thank you, Eric, she said softly. You don't know how much that means to me. Before he could respond, she closed the distance between them, her arms wrapping around his waist. The embrace was tentative at first, her touch light and unsure, but as he rested a hand on her shoulder, she relaxed against him. Eric's heart raced as he felt the warmth of her body pressed against his. Her tail brushed against his leg, a soft, unintentional movement that sent a ripple of awareness through him. You're warm, she murmured, her voice muffled against his chest. He chuckled lightly, trying to ignore the way her proximity affected him. That's what happens when you spend the evening hammering wood. Kayla pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a shy smile. It's comforting, she admitted, being close to you. Eric swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Her words were innocent enough, but the way she looked at him, golden eyes wide, her cheeks flushed, held a deeper meaning. You should try to get some rest, he said finally, his voice gruffer than he intended. Kayla nodded, though she didn't move. Her hands lingered on his sides, her touch hesitant but lingering. Would you stay with me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric's breath caught, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. The vulnerability in her expression, the unspoken plea in her voice, stirred something deep within him. Kayla, he began, his tone gentle but firm. You don't need me to sleep. You're stronger than you think. She looked down, her ears drooping slightly. I know, she said softly, but it's easier when you're there. Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew this was dangerous territory, but he couldn't bring himself to deny her. Fine, he said after a moment, just until you fall asleep. Her face lit up with gratitude, and she stepped back, her tail swaying slightly. Thank you, she said, her voice warm. As they left the workshop together, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the lines between them were blurring. He had always been her protector, her guide, but now he was something more, and that terrified him. Kayla's restlessness worsened as the days passed. The once manageable tension in the air between her and Eric grew heavier, charged with unspoken emotions and instinctual needs she could no longer suppress. Her attempts to keep a respectful distance faltered, leaving her drawn to him like a moth to a flame. Eric noticed the change, of course. He wasn't oblivious to the way her golden eyes lingered on him a moment too long or the subtle, almost unconscious ways she sought his presence. She hovered closer during meals, brushed against him when passing by, and seemed to find excuses to be near him at every opportunity. He tried to maintain boundaries, but it wasn't easy. Kayla's warmth and sincerity chipped away at his resolve. She wasn't manipulative. She was simply struggling, and that vulnerability made it impossible for him to ignore her. One evening, as Eric finished repairing a loose floorboard in the cabin, Kayla appeared in the doorway. The fading sunlight behind her cast a halo around her figure, highlighting the silvery fur of her tail and the soft curve of her ears. She wore one of his old flannel shirts, and the sight of her in it struck him with a surprising pang of tenderness. Eric, she began hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her. Do you have a moment? He sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow. Of course. What's on your mind? Kayla stepped into the room, her bare feet silent against the wood floor. She hesitated, her tail swishing nervously behind her. I just wanted to thank you again for everything. You don't have to keep thanking me, Eric said with a small smile. I told you, looking after you is part of my job. It's more than that, she said, her voice soft but insistent. You've been patient with me, even when I've been difficult. I don't think I could have gotten through this without you. Her sincerity made his chest tighten. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat when she crossed the room and knelt in front of him. The proximity was startling. Her face only inches from his, her golden eyes searching his own for something unspoken. Kayla, he began, his voice low. I know I've been clingy, she said quickly, her cheeks flushing. And I know it's probably uncomfortable for you, but I can't help it. Being near you, it makes me feel safe. Her confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Eric's instincts told him to tread carefully, but he couldn't deny the pull between them. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. You're not a burden, Kayla, he said firmly. I want you to feel safe here. That's what this place is for. Her ears twitched at his touch, and her gaze flicked to his hand before returning to his face. It's more than just safety, she admitted, her voice trembling. When I'm near you, it's like the chaos in my head quiets down. I don't feel so lost. Eric swallowed hard, his thumb unconsciously brushing against her shoulder. Her words stirred something in him, something he wasn't sure he wanted to face. Kayla, he hesitated, searching for the right thing to say. I care about you. That's why I want to do right by you. Kayla's expression softened, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. You already are, she whispered. For a moment, the room was silent except for the soft sound of their breathing. Then Kayla shifted closer, her hand resting lightly on his chest. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of his shirt, and Eric felt the warmth of her touch seep into his skin. Kayla, he said again, this time with a note of caution. She looked up at him, her golden eyes shimmering with emotion. I'm not asking for anything, she said quietly. I just needed you to know how I feel. Her vulnerability was disarming, and Eric found himself at a loss. He wanted to comfort her, to ease her pain, but he knew that crossing certain lines would only complicate things further. Still, the sincerity in her eyes made it impossible for him to pull away. Gently, he cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing against her cheek. I understand, he said softly, and I'm here for you, always. Kayla's breath hitched at his touch, and for a moment, she leaned into his palm, her eyes fluttering closed. The intimacy of the gesture wasn't lost on either of them, and Eric felt his resolve wavering under the weight of her trust. I should finish this, he said after a moment, his voice steady but tinged with regret. The floorboard won't fix itself. Kayla nodded, pulling back reluctantly. Right, she said, her tone light but laced with disappointment. I'll let you get back to it. She stood and retreated to the doorway, pausing to look over her shoulder. Thank you, Eric, for listening. Always, he replied, watching as she disappeared down the hall. Eric let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. He knew he was walking a fine line, but he couldn't bring himself to push her away. Kayla needed him, and as much as he tried to deny it, he realized he needed her too. Kayla's condition continued to intensify, her emotions spilling over into her actions in ways neither she nor Eric could ignore. Her restlessness turned into sleepless nights, and the tension between them grew with every shared glance, every accidental brush of hands. It was becoming impossible to pretend that things were normal. Eric tried to give her space, but it was a losing battle. Kayla seemed drawn to him like a tide to the shore, finding reasons to be near him no matter where he went. Her behavior wasn't overtly inappropriate, but there was a distinct shift in her demeanor, a vulnerability mixed with a quiet determination that made his heart race. One evening, as the rain pattered softly against the cabin windows, Eric sat by the fire, a book in hand. He was attempting to read, but his mind kept wandering back to Kayla. She had been unusually quiet all day, and he hadn't seen her since dinner. He told himself she was likely resting, but a nagging feeling in his chest wouldn't let him relax. As if summoned by his thoughts, Kayla appeared in the doorway. She was dressed in a simple cotton nightdress, her hair loose around her shoulders. The soft glow of the firelight highlighted her delicate features, and Eric found himself momentarily speechless. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice more gruff than he intended. She shook her head, stepping into the room. "No, it's worse tonight." Eric closed the book and set it aside, motioning for her to sit by the fire. "Come here. Maybe the warmth will help." Kayla hesitated for a moment before crossing the room and settling onto the rug near his chair. She pulled her knees to her chest, her tail curling around her legs. For a while, neither of them spoke, the crackling fire filling the silence between them. Finally, Kayla broke the quiet. "Eric, do you ever feel like there's something inside you that you can't control?" He frowned, unsure how to answer. "Sometimes," he said carefully. "Why? That's how I feel right now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like there's this energy I can't contain. It's overwhelming." Eric leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's the mating season, isn't it?" he asked gently. Kayla's ears flattened against her head, and she nodded, her cheeks flushing. "I thought I could handle it on my own," she said, her voice trembling. "But it's getting harder every day. I don't know what to do." Her confession struck him like a blow, and he felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to go through this alone," he said firmly. "We'll figure it out together." Kayla looked up at him, her golden eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You mean that?" "Of course," he said without hesitation. "You're not just my assistant, Kayla. You're important to me." Her lips parted in surprise, and for a moment, she simply stared at him. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand in hers. Her fingers were warm, her touch tentative but firm. "Eric," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't think you realize how much you mean to me. You've been my anchor through all of this. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel safe with you, like I can be myself." Her words stirred something deep within him, and he felt his resolve slipping. "Kayla," he began, his voice soft. Before he could continue, she leaned closer, her gaze locked on his. The space between them seemed to shrink, the air charged with an intensity that made his heart pound. Her fingers tightened around his hand, and he felt the warmth of her breath against his skin. "I'm sorry if this is too much," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I can't pretend anymore." Her confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Eric's mind raced as he struggled to find the right words. He knew he had to be careful, to tread lightly, but the emotion in her eyes made it impossible for him to pull away. "Kayla," he said finally, his tone steady, "you don't have to hide how you feel, but we need to take things one step at a time. I don't want to do anything that might hurt you." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked as though she might cry. Then she nodded, a small, grateful smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding." Without thinking, Eric reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. The gesture was simple, but the tenderness behind it made Kayla's breath hitch. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief moment. "Try to get some rest," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll be here if you need me." Kayla nodded, pulling back reluctantly. "Good night, Eric," she said softly, her voice warm with gratitude. As she left the room, Eric leaned back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh. The tension between them was undeniable, but he knew he couldn't let it dictate his actions. Kayla trusted him, and he was determined to protect her, no matter how difficult it might be. Kayla's resolve to handle her emotions independently crumbled with each passing day. Her instincts, sharpened by the relentless pull of the season, became impossible to ignore. Every fiber of her being seemed to gravitate toward Eric, and her usual poise was fraying at the edges. She had tried to channel her energy into distractions, reading, chores, even meditating, but nothing worked for long. Eric noticed. How could he not? The air between them had thickened with unspoken tension, and Kayla's presence felt more intense, more magnetic than ever. It wasn't just her proximity, though she found reasons to stay near him. It was the way her emotions seemed to radiate off her, unfiltered and raw. It was in the way she looked at him, as if he were the only thing keeping her grounded. One afternoon, as Eric worked on repairing the fence surrounding the cabin, Kayla approached him, her footsteps soft against the grassy path. She had been quieter than usual that day, her energy subdued but no less present. Now, she stood a few paces behind him, watching as he adjusted one of the loose wooden beams. "Do you need any help?" she asked, her voice tentative. Eric straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. He turned to face her, noting the way her ears twitched nervously. "I've got it under control," he said, offering her a small smile. "But you're welcome to keep me company." Kayla nodded, stepping closer. She watched him work for a while, her tail swaying absently behind her. The rhythmic sound of the hammer and the occasional chirping of birds filled the silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt strangely intimate. After a few minutes, Kayla spoke again. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" Eric paused, looking up at her. "Not really," he admitted. "It's peaceful here. No distractions, no chaos. Just the quiet." Kayla tilted her head, her golden eyes studying him. "But don't you miss people? The outside world?" He shrugged, setting the hammer down. "Sometimes, but I've seen enough of it to appreciate the solitude. Besides, I'm not completely alone." Kayla's cheeks flushed at his words, and she quickly looked away. "I guess that's true," she said softly. I've been wondering what it's like for you, being here with me." Eric frowned, sensing the vulnerability in her tone. "It's been good," he said honestly. "You've been good. I know this hasn't been easy for you, but you've handled it better than most would." Kayla's ears perked up slightly, but her expression remained uncertain. "It doesn't feel that way," she admitted. "I feel like I'm barely holding it together, and you've had to deal with all of this." "You're not a burden, Kayla," he said firmly, stepping closer. "You're doing your best, and that's all anyone can ask for." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The intensity in her gaze was almost too much to bear, but Eric didn't look away. He couldn't. There was something in her expression, a mixture of hope, longing, and fear, that held him in place. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Kayla said finally, her voice trembling. "You're the only thing keeping me sane right now." Eric's chest tightened at her words. He reached out instinctively, placing a hand on her shoulder. The warmth of her skin beneath his palm sent a jolt through him, but he forced himself to stay composed. "You're stronger than you think," he said gently. "But I'm here for you, always." Kayla leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "You say that, but I wonder how much longer you can stand it. How much longer I can stand it." Her honesty caught him off guard, and he struggled to find the right words. "Kayla, I'm sorry," she said quickly, stepping back. "I didn't mean to." "You don't have to apologize," he interrupted, his voice steady. "This isn't easy for either of us, but we'll get through it. Together." Kayla looked up at him, her expression softening. "You really mean that?" "Of course," he said without hesitation. "You're not alone in this." Her lips curved into a small, hesitant smile, and for the first time in days, some of the tension seemed to lift. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." They stood there for a moment longer, the space between them charged but not unbearable. Then Kayla stepped back, her tail swishing behind her. I should let you get back to work, she said, her voice lighter than before. Eric nodded, watching as she turned and walked away. As she disappeared around the corner of the cabin, he let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to see it through. Kayla needed him, and he wasn't about to let her down. Kayla's presence had become more than a constant in Eric's life. It was a force that demanded acknowledgement. Despite her earlier resolve to maintain distance, the line between restraint and inevitability had blurred. Each day brought her closer, in ways both subtle and overt. For every fleeting touch or stolen glance, there was an undercurrent of emotion neither could fully articulate. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the cabin in hues of amber and deep blue. Eric stood at the kitchen counter, preparing a simple meal. His focus was deliberate, an attempt to distract himself from the tension that had settled over the cabin like a heavy fog. Behind him, Kayla lingered. She leaned against the doorway, her posture relaxed but her tail flicking with restless energy. Her eyes followed his every movement, golden and piercing. Eric could feel the weight of her gaze, but he didn't turn to meet it. "Do you need help with that?" she asked after a long silence, her voice soft but filled with something unspoken. "I've got it," Eric replied without looking up. He chopped vegetables with practiced ease, the rhythmic sound of the knife filling the air. "Why don't you sit and relax?" Kayla hesitated, then stepped into the room. "I've been relaxing all day. I need to do something, or I'll go crazy." Eric paused, setting the knife down. He turned to face her, noting the faint flush on her cheeks and the way her ears twitched nervously. "Are you feeling worse?" he asked, concern lacing his tone. She shook her head, though her expression betrayed her discomfort. "Not worse, just restless. It's hard to explain." Eric wiped his hands on a towel, his brow furrowing. "You've been pushing yourself too hard. Maybe you should lie down." Kayla stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "I don't want to be alone right now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Eric's heart thudded in his chest as he struggled to maintain his composure. "You're not alone," he said carefully. "I'm here." Kayla's eyes softened, and she took another step forward. "I know. That's the only reason I'm holding on." Her honesty struck him like a physical blow, and he found himself at a loss for words. She was standing so close now, her presence overwhelming. He could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest, hear the faint hitch in her breathing. "Kayla," he began, his voice low, "you're stronger than you think. You've already come so far." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It doesn't feel that way," she said. "I feel like I'm unraveling." Eric reached out instinctively, his hand resting on her shoulder. The touch was meant to comfort, but the moment their skin connected, a spark of something deeper flared between them. Kayla's breath hitched, and she tilted her head to look up at him. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like every part of me is screaming for something I can't have." Eric's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly, his mind racing. He wanted to say something, to offer her reassurance, but the intensity in her gaze stole the words from his throat. For a moment, they stood frozen, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. Then Kayla reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. "You've done so much for me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I don't want to burden you more than I already have." "You're not a burden," Eric said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "You never have been." Kayla's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she smiled despite herself. "You always know what to say." "It's the truth," he said, his voice gentler now. "You don't have to go through this alone." Kayla stepped closer, her hands sliding down to his. The warmth of her touch sent a jolt through him, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he allowed her fingers to intertwine with his, their connection grounding them both. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to find out," Eric replied, his tone steady but filled with emotion. Kayla's gaze lingered on his, her expression open and vulnerable. I wish I could tell you how much that means to me. You don't have to, he said softly. I already know. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, the world around them fading into the background. Eric could feel the rapid beat of his own heart, the warmth of Kayla's hand in his. The tension that had been building between them for weeks now felt like a tangible force, drawing them closer together. Finally, Kayla broke the silence. You should finish dinner, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We both need to eat. Eric nodded, his grip on her hand loosening reluctantly. You're right, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Kayla stepped back, her fingers slipping from his. I'll set the table, she offered, her tone light but her eyes still holding the weight of their exchange. Eric watched her go, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions he couldn't fully process. He turned back to the counter, picking up the knife and resuming his work. But his mind wasn't on the vegetables in front of him. It was on Kayla, the warmth of her touch, the vulnerability in her eyes, and the undeniable connection that neither of them could ignore. As the days stretched on, Eric found himself caught in a delicate balance between his duty and his growing connection to Kayla. The tension that had simmered between them since the moment their paths had crossed seemed to intensify with each passing day. It was no longer just the unspoken pull of the mating season that held them together. It was something deeper, something that neither of them fully understood, but both of them felt with undeniable clarity. It was the sound of Kayla's footsteps that broke the stillness of the morning. Eric looked up from his desk, where he'd been sorting through some supplies, and saw her standing in the doorway. She was framed by the soft light of the morning sun, her golden eyes catching the light in a way that made them seem almost otherworldly. Morning, she said softly, her voice hesitant but warm. Eric smiled at her, the familiarity of her presence doing little to calm the fluttering sensation in his chest. Good morning. You're up early. I couldn't sleep, Kayla admitted, stepping into the room. Her tail flicked slightly, betraying the restlessness that still lingered inside her. I thought I might help you with whatever you're working on. Eric glanced at the pile of books and materials on the table, his mind flicking through all the tasks he still had to complete. He considered asking her to wait, to let him finish his work alone, but something in her gaze stopped him. There was a vulnerability in her eyes, a quiet plea for something more, something he hadn't quite figured out how to give. Sure, he said after a moment, his voice softer than he intended. You can help me sort through these supplies. Kayla smiled, her ears flicking in acknowledgement, and took a seat next to him at the table. She didn't say anything at first, simply watching him work. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, the weight of everything they hadn't addressed yet hanging like a shadow between them. Eric, Kayla finally said, breaking the silence. What do you think this will mean for us once the season is over? Her question hung in the air, its implications clear but not easy to confront. Eric set the book he was holding down, turning toward her. He saw the apprehension in her eyes, the uncertainty that mirrored his own. I don't know, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I wish I had an answer. Kayla nodded, her gaze drifting down to her hands resting on the table. I've been thinking about it a lot, she said, about everything we've been through and everything that's still to come. Eric could feel the ache in her voice, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. He knew that she had been struggling to make sense of her feelings, just as he had been. The mating season had changed everything between them, but it had also revealed something more, something neither of them could ignore. I don't want to make this harder for you, Kayla continued, her voice a little more fragile now, but I don't know how much longer I can fight this feeling. Eric reached out without thinking, his hand hovering near hers. Kayla glanced up at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply shared a look, a silent exchange that carried more weight than any words could. You don't have to fight it, Eric said softly, his voice almost a whisper. I've been feeling the same way. Her golden eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. You have? She asked, her voice barely above a breath. Eric nodded, his thumb brushing against her hand in a gentle, reassuring motion. I didn't know how to deal with it at first, he admitted. I've been trying to keep my distance, to stay in control, but Kayla's breath hitched, her heart racing as she looked at him. The proximity between them suddenly charged with a new, unfamiliar energy. But Eric's gaze softened, and he could feel his own heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't meant to bring them to this point, but now that they were here, there was no going back. But I can't ignore it anymore, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I care about you, Kayla, more than I thought possible. The words hung in the air between them, their meaning clear and undeniable. Kayla's lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his, and the connection was immediate. Warmth, comfort, and the undeniable pull of something deeper. I care about you too, she whispered, her voice a little shaky. I just don't know what it means for us, what happens next. Eric squeezed her hand gently, offering her a small smile. I don't have all the answers, he said, but I'm willing to figure it out. With you. For a long moment, they simply sat there, the weight of their shared understanding enveloping them. The world outside the cabin felt distant, irrelevant. There was only the two of them, caught in this strange, delicate moment of vulnerability and connection. Kayla let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing as the tension she'd been carrying seemed to dissipate, at least for now. She smiled softly at Eric, her eyes glistening with emotion. I don't know what's going to happen, she said, but I want to be here with you, no matter what. Eric nodded, his chest tight with a mix of relief and anticipation. We'll take it one step at a time, he said, his voice steady. Together, they sat in silence for a moment longer, both of them feeling the weight of the decision they just made. There was still uncertainty, still so much that neither of them could predict. But for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt quite as lost. As Kayla stood to leave the table, a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. I'll help you finish the supplies later, she said, her voice lighter than before. Eric watched her go, his heart still racing in his chest. He knew that their journey was far from over, but in that moment, it felt like they had taken the first real step toward something they both needed, something they both wanted. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. As the days passed, Eric and Kayla settled into a new rhythm, one that was shaped by an unspoken understanding and a shared commitment to navigating the uncertainty of their situation. The tension between them was still palpable, but it had become something different. It wasn't a force that pulled them apart. It was one that bound them together in ways neither of them had anticipated. The mating season, while still a presence in the background, had begun to lose its hold on Kayla. Her restlessness had subsided somewhat, though there were still moments when the instinctual urges of her nature flared up. During those times, Eric found himself at a loss for how best to support her. He wanted to be her anchor, her reassurance, but there were still boundaries he struggled to define. Boundaries that neither of them had the answers for. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Kayla sat on the porch, gazing out at the wilderness beyond the cabin. The cool evening air ruffled her fur, and her golden eyes seemed to reflect the fading light of the day. Eric joined her, settling beside her in the quiet of the evening. He didn't speak right away, simply sitting next to her in a companionable silence. Do you think it will ever feel normal? Kayla asked after a long pause, her voice soft but filled with the weight of the question. Do you think this? She motioned between the two of them, her hand sweeping in the air. Will ever feel normal? Eric turned his head to look at her, his gaze soft and understanding. He could see the uncertainty still lingering in her expression, the same uncertainty that had haunted her since the beginning of their time together. He knew, too, that he felt the same way. There was no easy answer to her question, no simple way to define what they were becoming. I don't know, he replied honestly. I don't think it's ever going to be normal, at least not in the way we think of it. But I don't think that's a bad thing. Kayla looked at him, her ears flicking slightly, and her tail wrapped around her legs in a gesture of thoughtfulness. Maybe normal isn't what we need. Maybe we just need to find something that works for both of us. Eric nodded. I think you're right. We'll figure it out as we go. There's no rule book for this. Her lips curved into a small, tentative smile. I guess we're writing our own rule book then. For the first time in days, the weight in her shoulders seemed to ease, the hint of a laugh in her voice carrying a sense of calm that Eric had missed. He reached out, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of solidarity, of quiet affection. We'll take it one step at a time, he said, his words a promise. We don't have to have all the answers right now. Kayla leaned her head against his shoulder, the warmth of her body grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. One step at a time sounds perfect, she whispered, her voice barely audible against the sounds of the forest around them. The evening stretched on in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind or the distant call of an owl in the trees. In that moment, with Kayla beside him and the world outside fading into the background, Eric felt a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. But there was still the matter of the future. What would happen once the mating season was over? Once Kayla's physical needs had subsided and the urgency of the season's pull had faded? Would the connection they'd shared remain? Or would the distance they had both tried to maintain return, as it had in the early days of their time together? The thought lingered in Eric's mind, but for now he pushed it away. They didn't need to answer everything tonight. They didn't need to solve the future, not when the present felt so right. I'm glad you're here, he said, his voice low, but filled with sincerity. Kayla tilted her head to look up at him, her golden eyes bright in the twilight. I'm glad I'm here too. It was in that quiet, simple exchange that Eric realized the depth of what had changed between them. They were no longer just two people caught in a situation neither fully understood. They had become something more, something that defied easy explanations. Their connection was built on trust, on understanding, and on the quiet moments they shared in the spaces between words. As the last of the daylight faded, Kayla sighed softly, lifting her head from his shoulder and standing up to stretch. I think I'll get some rest, she said, but I'll be here in the morning. I promise. Eric nodded, watching her as she walked back toward the cabin. He didn't move right away, still caught in the sense of contentment that had settled over him. There was still so much left unsaid, so many questions that remained unanswered, but for now, he was content to live in the moment they had. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Eric stood and followed her inside. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. He settled down on the couch, the sense of peace still lingering, and as Kayla made her way to the other side of the room, Eric felt the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem as uncertain. It was there, yes, but it wasn't something to fear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And for now, that was enough.